Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Tom Knowlton, CEO of CSR Talent Group. We are about a minute or two to the starting point. People are still joining us, so thank you all for who are joining us so far. Give us a minute and we will get going. Really appreciate all the people who are joining right now. I hope everybody who is in sweltering heat today is staying cool. I'm coming to you from New York, which not sweltering as much as some other places, but definitely hot. Let's see here. We've got another minute or so. Just a reminder too, for those of you who are joining the webinar now, I'll say this again, but if you have questions during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A and we will try to get to those at the end. We should have 20 or 30 minutes for questions at the end, and we may have a few in the middle, but feel free to do that. It's not in the chat, but in the Q&A. Let's see. All right, give it another 30 seconds. Thanks for everybody who just joined. We'll get going in a minute. Liz and Ann, thanks so much for doing this webinar with us today.
Pleasure. Excited to be here.
All right, I think it's time to start. Let's get going. So again, thank you everybody for joining us. We have people still joining us, but we're going to get started. Today's webinar, as you can see, is CSR and ESG in the fashion industry, past, present, and future. And we are so pleased to have Liz Alessi and Ann Cantrell with us today. I'll get to their introductions in a second. Before we start, though, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about CSR Talent Group and this webinar series. So for those of you who don't know, we are a network of about 180 plus vetted CSR, ESG, and sustainability experts, 95% of whom have worked across multiple corporate environments. And we bring those individual experts or small groups of experts to companies and base it on the company's unique maturity, meaning where they are and what they need and their particular goals and timelines. So we customize our approach for every company depending on where they are and what they need. The Insider Insights series, these webinars, we think are pretty interesting because we're able to bring unique perspectives like Ann and Liz today. And they're going to give us actionable insights and talk about a range of experiences and approaches. And you can't usually get that from a lot of webinars because it's coming from an individual company sometimes or from a consulting firm that's really talking about their approach. And in this case, what we're doing is bringing a variety of people to the webinars who can talk about their unique perspectives based on their experience. So let's get into it. So, Ann, can you take us to the next slide? So,
yes, hello, everybody.
Yeah, so do you want to introduce the session and you guys can introduce yourselves?
Absolutely, thanks so much, Tom. And I'm excited to be here today and be part of the CSR Talent Group. We're here to talk about the detrimental effects of the fashion industry, but it's really about so many transferable thoughts and critical thought across all industries. I'm sure you've seen the news and maybe you're living through it like Tom said, but to quote the New York Times today, the world is sweltering in record-breaking heat. And I just watched The Inconvenient Truth again last week on a plane of all places, but realizing that came out over 17 years ago. And we've done little to fix the situation, but instead really dramatically cause a lot more harm. And it's really devastating to think about. And the fashion industry is a big part of that. Whether you're working in it or not, it affects us all. We all wear clothes. Of course, we also, we're buying more clothes than ever before. And I'll talk about this later too, but they're also cheaper than ever before. So the system is definitely broken. We also, when you talk about the fashion industry, we're talking about one of the most human labor intensive industries in the world. AI and chat GPT might be taking over industries and maybe buying jobs might be altered and product development jobs might be different in the future, but you can't sew technically an armhole without a human being. And There was actually an interesting headline in the sourcing journal yesterday that said, even AI thinks garment workers' conditions are terrible. It went on to say that ChatGPT refused to create fake job ads based on real life scenarios, denying them as too exploitative. So meanwhile, we have a perfect storm between social media shopping and a terrifying situation where we just keep wanting more and more and more. So we're here to talk about that today. And as I said, as Tom introduced us, I'm here with my good friend, Liz Alessi. Liz, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to the world of sustainability?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Anne, for that. And thank you, Tom, for hosting us today. Anne and I have known each other a very long time. So I have to say, I'm taking great personal pleasure in spending this hour with my dear friend, who constantly surprises me with all of her knowledge and her amazing teaching style too as a professor. But we both actually met at Coach Leather Goods, which is where my journey didn't begin, but that's where I'll start today. Full disclosure, I have been a participant in causing some of these issues, some of the waste that we're talking about here. So I have made it my professional mission, and my daughter will tell you my personal mission too. And I'm like, turn the water off, to combat that in every way that we possibly can. So this is what we're here today to talk to you guys about.
Yes, and Liz, it's so great to be here with you. You've come to my classes so many times. We've had dinners and so much professional banter about this as well. My background, I not only am an educator as an associate professor at FIT, but I also am a store owner. So I come from this perspective in both environmental sustainability as well as economic sustainability and trying to make the business case for a lot of these discussions and decisions that we're talking about today. I have a store in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Before that, my background is in the fashion industry. I was, as Liz says, at Coach. That was my last corporate gig. But before that, I was at Ralph Lauren, Talbot's, and Brooks Brothers. At FIT, I started teaching a class, sustainability in fashion management, and I got my MBA with a concentration in sustainability through that path. And as everybody on this call, I'm sure knows or will know by the end of this hour, once you start learning some of these things, it's hard to unlearn them. So even though my husband jokes that I grew up off the grid before there was a grid, I kind of just learning that from my parents and the world around us, it's just become ingrained in who I am. So excited to be here today to talk about this industry that, although we love so much, is doing so much harm to the planet. So we'll just talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. We're going to get up to speed on the past, talk about what's being done presently and what the future holds as well. We changed our order around a little bit to make it flow a little bit better, but you'll hopefully get a lot out of the next hour. So just to start diving into it, the fashion industry is a $1.7 trillion industry. If you are looking at some of the related industries, congressional paperwork says it puts it at $3 trillion. And it's interestingly one of the least regulated industries. I don't know if you are familiar with Maxine Beday's book Unraveled, but she spoke at FIT this spring and talked about why she thought it was the most unregulated industry. And one of her answers was about that it was clothing. It's a more feminine industry, and perhaps that was one reason why maybe it wasn't as regulated as some things like oil and automobile industry or airlines. But regardless of that, even though we are at this huge turning point in our industry, is we really are looking to regulations to help us get us out of this mess. So again, no one really talks about how big the fashion industry is compared, but if you compare it to, it's bigger than international aviation and maritime shipping combined. The oil industry is a $2 trillion industry. So if you think about that, some of the richest people in the world own fashion brands like LVMH or Inditex and Zara. These are some of the richest people in the world, larger than oil tycoons. And again, as I said, and we'll talk about more, we are really at this point where we're putting a lot of causing a lot of harm to the industry. And this is just one picture of many that I'm sure you guys have seen of all the waste that is put out there in our world. We are throwing away more clothes than ever before, but fashion production takes up to 10% of human carbon emissions. It dries up water sources. It's the second largest consumer of the world's water supply. And 85% of all textiles go to the dump each year. And that's really what we're looking at here, even though this is a rainbow version of all that. Even washing clothes brings a lot of microfibers into the ocean each year, the equivalent of 50 billion plastic bottles. Microfibers are now found everywhere, including in Antarctica. So we really, and this is from our textiles degrading down and causing harm. 92 trillion tons of clothing and related waste are thrown away each year. And we're also dumping this clothing in different parts of the world, particularly in places, third world countries like Ghana, that gets 15 million used clothing each week from America, Europe, and China. And 40% of that doesn't even see a second life. So we're dumping our old textiles, not even that old, maybe not just unsellable in other parts of the world, and causing havoc along with it. And as I mentioned earlier, the textile industry is one of the worst to exploit women. 80% of global garment workers are women, paid some of the lowest wages or never paid at all. So some of the regulations we're talking about today are covering some of these things. We can overload you with statistics, but an average of 81 pounds of clothing is thrown away each year. And when we think about why, it's not just social media and TikTok and Instagram and all of that, but the trend cycle is faster and quicker than ever before. We are living through trends like on a daily basis instead of on a seasonal basis as we used to in the past.
And there's an interesting debate, if I can pipe in on that one, Anne, around sort of like, whose fault is this? We like a good finger pointing argument where, you can look to the consumer and say, you guys should be buying less. Then you also have to look at the brand and say, you guys should be producing less. So we'll get into more of that later and what's really happening and what we can each do about it.
Yes, thanks, Liz. I thought this was interesting to show the average wear time and how much it's gone down over the past 15, 20 years or so. I think the average wear now is 7 times before we dispose of something. What's not represented on this chart, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, was that we are also, the cost of clothing has gone down versus other consumer packaged goods. We boast about, in many cases, how cheap things are. So we're really in this quandary. Just again, a couple more things to consider. A t-shirt takes 2,700 liters of water to make. That's enough to live off for 3 years. A pair of jeans, enough to live off for 7 years. And I'm sure we're all thinking about how many jeans and t-shirts with my students. I am always concentrating on those 2 items since we have so many of those in our closets. But we're buying more, we're paying less for it, we're wearing it less, and we're discarding it faster.
Last graph, just so I may have misheard you. So the average number of times an item is worn is around 160 now, is that correct?
No, that's actually, it's now 7. This is just showing decrease over the last several years. This is clothing sales have gone up, we're wearing it less, and we're cycling through things faster than ever before. This is actually from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I hope everybody on the call is familiar with Ellen MacArthur Foundation. They are doing a lot towards circularity in the fashion industry, and there's a plethora of information out there through the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. For everyone that is not familiar with the fashion development process, we wanted to walk you guys through design phase, where we're coming up with a 2-dimensional design that's then we're going to commercialize into a 3D product. We are looking for raw materials that we can produce this in, which is where there's Liz, I know, is going to talk about this key point as well, because there's a lot of opportunity here when we talk about changes in the fashion industry, a lot of technology and opportunities in this raw material phase. The garment production phase, I've mentioned that a few times, with exploitative workers and poor working conditions. But obviously everything that we're designing and creating is getting made en masse. And then the distribution process, we are, most of our production, 95 to 98% of our production has moved overseas. So then we are not just bringing it into the United States through boat, but then once it gets here, we have to send it to the stores. And then ultimately selling it in a retail format, whether that's in person or online. And we all know through the pandemic how much online sales have shot through the roof. Amazon just had their Prime days last week. I saw they made record numbers, but it really, they're actually the #1 producer of clothing in the United States. I'm not even sure if people realize that, but Amazon is in there. Liz, I know you wanted to speak about some opportunities here. I'll let you take over from here.
Yeah, I mean, I would just want to add in also that the amount of impact, the level of impact that the raw materials, garment production, distribution, but specifically raw materials and garment production have, we're going to get into it a little bit later. But the numbers that Anne is sharing are insanely large. And also the garment production, like she mentioned, being overseas is by far the cheapest model. And as a participant in a multi-billion-dollar supply chain executive level position, it is a constant battle to make things, from the brand perspective, to make things faster and cheaper. And that's really what the brands are looking at. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, that's their choice. And we're going to get to some positive things too, but just to really highlight the fact that it really is the most cost-effective thing for the brand to be producing these things in overseas and then shipping them. It seems crazy to us, but that's the reality. And it's even more cost-effective for them to be distributing it in all kinds of crazy formats around the United States too. So there's a DC, and then it goes to maybe another DC, and then it goes to a store. So it's really, it's really unfortunate the way the model has been set up. And it's going to take all of us really working together and working independently to sort of rage against the machine, because it's always been like this from the dawn of when Anne and I even met each other, which is like a bazillion years ago.
But Liz, the reason it's cost effective is primarily because of labor costs?
It's absolutely because of labor costs,
Okay.
yes. Yes.
I also just want to point out that this is a linear model, and we're really working, and everything that we're speaking towards is about circularity. So taking this and turning it into a more circular perspective, where in the design process, we're coming up with ways that, what is the end use of the product going to be? So, we're rethinking fashion in totally different ways. Instead of disposing of things in the landfill, maybe in the future, after we wear a dress, we can put it in a salt bath and it'll disintegrate, or thinking about all these things in the design process. Also, raw materials that usually consists of 65% of the cost of the goods. So if we can think about all the material that we're taking back and repurposing, I think this is where real opportunity comes as well. If we can use our own materials to create new raw materials, we'll really, could be a win-win in so many different ways.
And again, it's really important for us to challenge each one of these that you see on your screen. So as a designer, how can you design for circularity would be a good example. As a raw materials person, how can you infuse more recycled materials or reused materials into the way you're working today? And garment production, you can challenge whether, you can nearshore or localize your production a little bit more. And distribution, again, what can we do in our own communities to make more sense of this for us in the environment that we live in? And even in the retail stores, you know, it's shocking the amount of effort that goes into visual merchandising and displays and all of these things. Retail stores are also a big impact.
Absolutely.
So on this slide, we wanted to just make sure everyone kind of had a baseline of the scopes. I remember not that long ago, I wasn't quite clear on what the scopes of CO2 impact are and where they come from. So let's start on the left with scope 2, so our indirect resources. These would be emissions from purchased electricity for your own use. So this would be where the energy that you're using is actually made. And then your scope 1 are your direct resources. So this is on-site energy consumption and material processing. And unfortunately, again, going back to our overseas factories, given the nature of the countries that these factories are in, there is not as much access to renewable resources as we think there is. So that's a huge work driver that I know a lot of different organizations are talking about now, is how to get more renewable energy and move away from diesel and other types of petrol-based situations that we don't want to be in, and especially coal. That would be a big problem as well overseas. So scope 1, and then scope 3 is your upstream and downstream sources. And so this would be your transportation and distribution, the processing of solid products, end-of-life treatments, business travel, and investments. Another thing we wanted to make sure everyone had a baseline, and we'll go into this also a little bit in a little more detail, are the tiers of manufacturing. And we talk a lot about this, but want to make sure everyone is clear on what it actually means. So tier 4 is your raw material extraction. So imagine, let's go back to Anne's example of a pair of jeans, right? That pair of jeans is actually going to start out as a cotton plant. So what we've been able to do through Ellen MacArthur and a lot of other organizations like Fashion for Good is really quantify what the impact is on each one of these tiers. So we know as a general statement that raw material extraction, which includes the cultivation extraction from earth and plants or animals, is about 24% of the impact of your eventual finished good. Then moving into tier 3, once the cotton has been picked, it goes into raw material processing. This is when your cotton becomes a yarn, it goes to the spinner, and then that's 15%, so a little bit less. And then you get into the material production, and this is heavy into the water use, as Anne had mentioned as well, because you have to be processing these materials, you have to be dyeing them. It's heavy energy use because temperatures have to be quite high in addition to a large amount of water that's being used. So you see the largest number here, which is 52% of the emissions. And then the finished product assembly, which is only 9%. So a lot of times, and we're going to talk about this a little more later too, if you are an ESG lead person at a company, and it's your tasked with how to reduce your impact, to reduce your emissions, the first thing you want to do is look at where your impact lies. So if you are a heavy denim producer, you're like a Levi's, or if you are a heavy cotton producer, like a Ralph Lauren, for example, you really want to be looking at probably cotton production, because that would be your 24%, and in addition to material production at your 52%. And then those two impacts, if you can then start to reuse some of those materials or start using recycled materials, the numbers come down dramatically. I don't know, Anne, if you have anything else to add on that.
I just wanted to say that most brands were really only can go back one tier and not really identify even back, you know, 2 or certainly not 3 and 4, because we talk about traceability and transparency in the fashion industry, we're really, we're beholden to so many different counterparts in the industry, whether it's the raw material suppliers, the material manufacturers, the finished product manufacturers, but none of those are really are owned by the company in 99% of the cases. So being able to have clarity and transparency and accountability, which is another important part of this as well, to improve on the situation from their baseline is really, really important. But to Liz's point about looking at some of this, what I might say like low-hanging fruit, when we look at the larger percentages, it could be an easy place for someone from CSR group to help your organization figure out what the easy next steps can be from to help rectify some of these issues. And I wanted to talk about, before Liz gets into some really cool case studies and things that she's been working on, personally, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing to help turn this big ship around, right? There have been some US-based legislation that has been passed. California, I'm sure as many of you know from different aspects of our world, is ahead in many angles, and they introduced and passed SB 62, the Garment Workers Protection Act, that passed in fall 2021 and went into law last year. California has the highest rate of garment workers in the US, and now instead of being paid by the piece, by how much they were producing, they are now being paid an hourly rate. The myth, we think made in the US is always a good thing, but it's really not often the case either. There's a lot of production issues, manufacturing issues here in the United States. And the myth I think that many people have of made in America with thinking that it's American materials is really what I say, like a myth. There's very few are doing that, if any. So we need to do better at home first as well, instead of shipping our problems overseas too. Another one that actually is really interesting is really just devastating to learn about, but also interesting to observe because it was passed with bipartisan support. And it's hard to believe that this is happening today. And I don't think the common person on the street knows that there is a huge issue with human rights abuses with the Uyghur people from the Chinese government and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, China, often characterized as genocide. And this beginning in 2014, the Chinese government incarcerated more than 1 million Muslims without any legal process into internment camps, separated families, and so much more devastation to these people. And this area of China is a leading producer of cotton in China, and 20% of the world's cotton is coming from China, and 80% of this is domestically made, domestically produced in Xinjiang. So the idea that could possibly have some of this forced labor produced cotton on our bodies is quite high. So the government passed, as I said, with bipartisan support, a federal law that prohibited American brands from funding this forced labor among ethnic minorities in this region. But going back to the prior slide where we're not even sure about where our goods are always coming from, this is leading us more to having more need for transparency and accountability in the supply chain, because now it's also a law from a federal perspective in terms of this cotton from China. And
can I jump in here just for a second? I just want to remind people, if you have questions, put it in the Q&A. But briefly, I know those regulations are pretty recent, but have you seen or has anybody been tracking the impact of that yet?
Yeah, it's been coming up a lot. Like, how do we even prove this? Which is why we have to maybe start smaller. And this, what I'm going to talk about next, is not a small act at all. It's quite large, but I think, in order to be able to understand the implications and be able to call businesses out on this, we need more steps in place to do that. It's very hard to prove that. It's very hard to show. Sorry, I'm in Midtown Manhattan right now and it's very loud outside. But anyway, it's questionable about how much is being caught in
Yeah.
these. But what I have been spending the last year and a half really researching and talking about and working with brands about is a proposed and potentially transformative new act that was proposed in October, introduced in October of 2021, the New York Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act. And saying this would say that businesses that have a global, that do business in New York and have a global revenue of $100 million for footwear and apparel, which is really all the brands we can think of a name, are going to need to map out at least 50% of their supply chain and show improvement, again, that accountability over the next 18 months. Now, why does that matter outside of New York? Because what we've seen in California too is, in some cases, brands are doing things specifically for California, but in general, New York's a big state. If we're selling it here, it's going to be a global push to make sure that this is covered by all brands, because it's not just New York that's going to reap the benefits of this, but everybody will as well. So, and the really interesting, well, several interesting things about this is that anyone can call a company out for non-compliance. We've seen a student, a SUNY student actually called out H&M for greenwashing and won. And but here the fine for non-compliance can be up to 2% of annual revenue. And we think about Nike being a $50 billion business, it's a lot of money. So there is financial implications to this if they are not met. So this is it was introduced in October 2021. Then we had the person that introduced it was running for another position. And then the governor ran for re-election, whatever it's called, last November. And so it's been pushed to the wayside a bit. It's been in committee. It was revised in November 2022 to get some more people on board. Now garment workers can also bring issues and legal claim about lost wages to brands directly. We saw this come up a lot during COVID, and Remake has been really, we're not familiar with Remake. Maybe we have some Remake people on here, I'm not sure. But they have been doing a lot towards voicing the garment workers, hearing what their perspective and point is. And they brought up a huge pay up movement during COVID when brands weren't paying for goods that were already produced. So it's currently in committee. What I also want to talk about briefly is also introduced into act as kind of a continuation of that California law, where it was introduced by New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand last May, where we would take that Fabric Act and turn the California Act and applying it to the whole country. So create a national garment industry registry, new requirements to hold fashion brands and retailers accountable for workplace violations, and incentivize responsible production. They would actually also get a 30% reshoring tax credit to move manufacturing operations back to the United States, and set an hourly pay in the garment industry and eliminating that piecemeal, as I said, piece rate. And we are really seeing some amazing and exciting things come from the European Union. So although the United States is lagging behind, again, when we have regulations set in one part of the world, they'll hopefully reflect in other parts. But the EU has a really exciting vision for 2030. They're talking about setting new design requirements for textiles to make them last longer, easier to repair and recycle. There'll be new requirements on the minimum recycled content in textiles. They're working to improve circularity of the fashion sector and reducing waste. There's actually already has comprehensive laws on waste, but the EU is looking carefully at new ways to make producers responsible for textiles that sell after the sale, the very effective tool because it encourages them to make items that last longer, even more importantly, easier to recycle when they each reach the end of their useful life. They're talking about tackling the microplastics challenge that I talked about earlier, and really protecting people from greenwashing. It's so important that consumers are empowered to make sustainable choices. In March, the EU proposed a common criteria against greenwashing and misleading environmental claims. And this really will work to help get rid of some of those environmental claims, such as eco-friendly, good for the environment, green, and make it difficult and costly for businesses to say things like that without having some factual information to back that up. They're also talking about new rules on corporate sustainability and due diligence, and really working hard in many exciting ways.
That's a perfect segue to the next slide here, which I'm going to speak to. One of the regulations that the EU is starting out with, but we definitely think is going to be coming here to the US, there's already some talk about it, is the Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR. So in a nutshell, basically what this means, if you're a brand and you're producing a product, it doesn't matter if you sell the product to a customer, at the end of that product's life, you are responsible for making sure that whatever materials are involved are being disposed of responsibly or recycled. Unfortunately, in the past, I'm sure you all know, there have been brands that, and this is common practice, I'm not calling anyone out, but Burberry was caught incinerating a lot of their product. This is common practice, especially with luxury brands that have a lot of logo on their product and proprietary materials, etc. Unfortunately, that does happen. It did happen. Also, the other brands have been called out for destroying product and then dumping it into landfill, even though it's perfectly good. So as this is coming upon us, it's really interesting in my world as a consultant now, because I every week another brand gets in touch with me and says that we have excess merchandise and we have product that we don't know what to do with. And so I'm already seeing the pressures percolating here in the US with some of these brands. So I wanted to briefly talk to you about a couple of options that brands have, and just I threw in a couple of examples. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these. If not, feel free to Google. But the first thing I have here is take back. So that would be, the brand has a bin set up in their store, and they're inviting the customers, when you're done with using our product, or even sometimes other brands' products, we will take them back and we will come up with solutions and what to do. And then repair is a good example of another way that you can extend the life of the product that you're selling. So Patagonia is a great example of this. There are other brands that are doing it very well as well, but basically saying, hey, we want you to keep using the product that we sold you in the first place, and we're going to help you extend the life of that product by repairing it for you. There's a lot of talk about resale, and there's some toing and froing about it in terms of positive negatives, but ThredUp is a great example of that. It's a platform where brands can resell some of their merchandise. The negative of that is that about 50% of what, for example, ThredUp gets, they do not sell, and then it ends up having to go into another one of these streams. I love the idea of tailoring, and there's a great company called Hempster that's doing that, because there are actually a lot of garments that end up being discarded because they just don't fit right, especially jeans. And actually, Hempster has proven through their data analytics that most of what they're doing is just like hemming pants, like just making them shorter so they fit people. So I think this is a great solution as well. I wanted to put donate in here because I think it's an important puzzle piece here. When we donate to Dress for Success or Salvation Army or Goodwill, those organizations are doing amazing social work here in North America, and we should support them. So donating is always a good option. someone else, if you don't want your shirt or your jeans, someone else might want that. So especially if it's good quality product, I always urge people to please donate to charities. Upcycle and upcraft. I put Coach as an example there because I was a participant in the initial launch of the Coach Reloved program, which I think is just brilliant, where if there are products that come back that can no longer be repaired to their original form and be given back to the customer, they apply a creative element to it. So there's a design team that's actually working on this to say, okay, well, this strap is broken, but I have that bag over there, and that strap could maybe fit on this bag. And they're putting a lot of amazing creative energy into this. And then Coach is now able to resell that online on their e-com stores. And one of the things that I think is important to talk about is that this is also a revenue driver. So it's important that we're saying, like, yes, do these things, but also try to make money so that your company can be whole. Disassemble is a really important aspect of this. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with people that are working on athletic footwear circularity. And it's mind-boggling how many different components are in a sneaker. Just have a look at your sneakers, and it's shocking how many different, going back to the tiers, how many different materials are actually going in to make this one product. And then what do you do with it at the end of the day? The easiest thing to do is take it apart and then try to figure out, okay, the rubber goes over here, all the metal goes over here, and then you can recycle it, but it's very hard to recycle a complex product. Material reuse, I'm going to go into in a lot more detail coming up, but BVH, otherwise known as Beyond Retro, is sort of like the king of the castle with this one, and that goes back to the scopes that we were talking about here. If we reuse a fabric that's already been made, you're essentially eliminating tiers 2 through 4 of your supply chain, which is, depending on the material, 80 to 90% of your scope 3 emissions. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then recycling, obviously this is a great option. The problem with recycling, although RenewCell is doing a great job with cellulosics right now, is that there's so much product, as Anne was speaking to earlier, and the capacity of these recyclers is not there yet. In the next 2 years, we'll see this growing exponentially, but today, unfortunately, there's way too much stuff and not enough capacity. And then downcycling, I wanted to plug this in here just to make sure everyone understands what these words mean. So downcycling would be, you're taking a product and you might not be able to make, let's say it's a shoe, might not be able to make another shoe out of it, but maybe you can make some playground material, or maybe you can make yoga mats out of it, or insulation is a good example. So like I put Madewell in here because they do have a in-store take-back program for denim, and that actually goes in to be made into insulation. So that's downcycling, when the value decreases of the product. Okay, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on a company called Recircled, one of my favorites. The founder is an exceptional person and full of energy, not afraid of a challenge. And one thing we want to make sure everyone takes away here is that you can do something. You can do something. Yes, this is a big problem, but we can all participate and take a chance on a pilot program or something like that and really make a difference. So Recircled is an incredible company who's actually working with a lot of different brands. Every time I speak to them, my jaw drops at not only the number of brands they're working with, but the quantity of excess inventory that these brands have. So what I'm talking about is maybe a product that has issues with it in factory that cannot be sold. Could be returned product that they don't want to resell again. Could be perfectly good product that just doesn't fit in the assortment anymore, or it could be legacy product that's been sitting in a warehouse for 15 years. Recircled is the master of disassembly. So they say, okay, we will take your stuff that you don't want any longer. We'll assess it, and then we'll figure out some way of either upcycling, recycling, or even downcycling. That's not listed on the slide, but that's what they're doing as well now. So upcycling would be, I disassemble it. I have a good piece of leather that came from a handbag. I can maybe make a shoe out of it now, but I want to be using that leather for something. Recycling, obviously, you're turning, like, let's say, cotton fibers into another cellulosic fiber to then be spun into another thing. And then downcycling is basically, let's pelletize it into some PET, and then we can turn it into like a plate or a cup or something that's made from recycled material. And so Recircled is really a pioneer in this area. And I see this growing much more in the future because of the complexity and the different materials that are in all that legacy product that are out in the market today. And then BVH, I mentioned a little bit earlier. This company actually works with all of the North American charities to collect the merchandise that we as Americans give to these charities, but do not get sold in the stores. So 75% of what we donate actually doesn't get sold in the stores. So BVH comes in and purchases the majority of that to the tune of about 4 million garments per week, and then figures out solutions for it. The one that I'm going to highlight today is their collaboration with Converse. So you're a pair of jeans, nobody wants you as a pair of jeans anymore. Converse sends their pattern piece to BVH. They cut out the pieces, send those cut pieces to the finished goods factory. Converse makes the shoe, sells the shoe. And this is actually the lowest carbon impact shoe that all of Nike has, in fact, because again, you're cutting out those 3 tiers of the supply chain. They also have retail, wholesale, and recycling avenues that can be used as well. I wanted to highlight the Converse program because this is, I feel like, the North Star of being able to reuse existing materials. We've been talking a lot about denim, but I wanted to make sure you guys saw all of the different types of materials, and there's more to come. Spoiler alert, there's some really exciting things coming in the next year too that the team has been working on. But I mean, you wouldn't imagine that your velvet dress that you wore to the Christmas party last year could become a Converse Chuck, but it did. And that was the winter launch this past year. Oxford shirting, fleece, Hawaiian shirts. And the one thing I want to just highlight here, because I know there are a lot of people that are working in the same field that I am in now, is that you really have to flip the design and the material sourcing. And you have to make it really work opposite. So you start with the material you have. You can give some idea. Let's say, I want Hawaiian shirts, but start with the material that you have and then work into that material. And that's why Converse has been successful in this, because they're really thinking about it in a more circular fashion and not a linear fashion, as Anne was speaking to earlier. So more to come there.
So we really just wanted to end here before the Q&A saying that Liz and I and other members of the CSR talent group are here to help you through that journey to towards transparency in the fashion industry, analyzing, improving your supply chain, while also helping to build the business case for sustainability.
Questions that came in during the presentation, so people were definitely paying attention and are highly interested. I'm going to get to a few of them in a minute, but I just wanted to ask you both to start. You gave us a lot of information on the process, the different stages, the impacts both on climate, water, the actual dumping of products. When you look at this problem, and this may be too big a question to be able to answer, but I'm just curious, where do you think the approach should really focus by companies? And are there I know you provided a couple of company examples here, but which companies do you think are really having a major impact by, tackling the problem, maybe not at the end of the cycle, but more at the beginning? So I'm just curious what you're thinking about that. And then I'll get into, we've gotten about 12 or 13 questions that I'll be able to get through some of them, but why don't we start there? Anne, do you want to take that, or Liz?
Liz, do you want to take that one? I was just thinking about coming up with a baseline and going from there. That was my initial thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's any company, it's a really good question, but any company that has come up with science-based targets is doing it right, because there are so many different things that we can do. But if you actually look at your impact across your entire scopes, and then you say, this is where we want to tackle, because this is the worst problem we have, and we want to actually quantify a reduction, and this is how we're going to do it, that's a brand that is doing it right.
Yeah.
And then anyone right now also who is designing for circularity, and what that means usually is either designing using a monomaterial mindset, where you don't have to disassemble the product, but let's say everything is made of PET, it can all go into one recycling stream without the bottleneck of disassembly. And also, I think that there are companies that any really one of these companies that is doing one of the things that I listed there is doing something right. But one thing to remember is that companies are afraid to talk about a lot of the work that they do for fear of getting in trouble for greenwashing. And then there's another term that's come in vogue now, which is called green hushing, which is like, we don't want to talk about it because we're afraid of getting called out for greenwashing. And I would just urge everyone to, as Anne was mentioning earlier, be really transparent about the fact that this is a journey. If we had all of the answers right now, we wouldn't be having this webinar today and having these conversations. So let's work together, hold hands, and really acknowledge the fact that we don't have all the answers, but we do need to dip a toe in the water and do something.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And just a reminder, since we probably won't get through all these questions, this will be recorded, and we'll also send you these questions, Anne and Liz, for you guys to answer on your own at a later point. We can put that up on the website. And all of our webinars in this series are up on our website if anybody wants to go back to see them. One question from somebody at a smaller company, I won't read the entire question, but just to summarize, they don't have a large budget. And so there's a lot that you're recommending here, tracking, auditing. You need people to do a lot of that. Where, and maybe you just gave the answer, a small company should be starting with just figuring out their baseline, but if they were spending money on consultants or staff, where would you think they should focus?
Anne, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's an excellent question too. I think that thoughtful decision making goes a long way, and thinking about I'm not saying readjusting what your profitability is or anything like that, but readjusting your focus on the business decisions, and maybe looking to something like an environmental profit and loss, or as a way of making better decisions along the process. So like fabric decisions as well. So not, as an example, not necessarily just being a fabric in the fabric department, but is reporting into design and reporting into different levels of the system. So it's embedded in different levels of the decision-making process. So we're not, like we said, we're starting with the end in mind with design, but having the company think about those things throughout the process. I think that the idea that sustainability costs money and a triple bottom line business costs money can be a misnomer, because ultimately we know that businesses that have more thought towards these are going to be around longer, have more goodwill with the consumer, have more thought throughout the whole process. So I think that part of it is decision making at a more granular level and not just at the end.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here's an interesting question. Somebody's asked, are there any examples of structured ways or programs that companies are helping their employees, specifically with end of product life solutions, volunteering, donating, small stipend for tailor option? Are you guys seeing interesting examples of companies that are engaging their employees this way?
I think to a certain extent, yes, but the problem of a company is not what the employees have in their closets, it's how much they're selling to everybody else. So what I've seen success with engaging your employees in like pilots is like, would this work if we try to do this? But if it does, then you expand it out to your customer base, because the amount of people that are involved in creating the product versus the number of products that are put out there is obviously not as impactful at all.
I will say, though, I think the question speaks to corporate culture, and it reminded me that we didn't even talk about B Corps or benefit corporations, which is an avenue for a business if they want to become more accountable in a more social aspect than just for the bottom line, more, as I said, a triple bottom line. So I feel like some of those things, I haven't seen them personally, but I think could be part of a B Corp certification process, and some of those questions within the certification.
Another question is about measuring human rights. How many retailers meaningfully measure human rights issues in their scope 1? And I know we talked about a related question is the labor cost is such a huge part of the costs of producing these goods. And I'm just wondering what you're seeing as far as how people are dealing with the labor issues, especially obviously the human rights issues. And, are there companies that are doing this really well?
Well, I want Liz to take that, but I just have to also interject to say that we are not paying enough. The manufacturing is not the most expensive part. The textiles are the most expensive part. That it's crazy that that's true. But anyway, but I'll have Liz take that question.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be a bit pessimistic here and say that it's mostly a fail across the board. It's very, very difficult to undo these mammoth supply chains and to even pick apart and figure out where things are happening and who's doing them. Some brands are much further ahead. Anyone who has like a QR scanning code or NFT tag, something where you can actually, they're being super transparent about where they're getting things and who's making them, but there is so much more work to be done. So I think the legislation that Anne was talking about earlier is incredibly important to prompt companies to spend a little bit more money to try to really figure this out. And this is also where I think, bringing in outside consultants is very helpful too, because you might not need one dedicated person at your company that's going to be figuring out all of these problems. But you can find someone out there, probably in the CSR talent group, that shameless plug, that can actually help solve some of these problems. So, if you are a smaller company and you have limited resources, I think this is partly why we're here, to share that there is a whole network of people that can help you.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, I just wanted to also say back to that other question about small business and a smaller business, and what Liz was saying is also there's things like the Open Supply Hub, if people are familiar with that, accessible collaborative supply chain mapping platform that's free to anybody, and there's a lot of shared businesses on there. You can see who else is using the same facilities or fabrications as you, and get in touch and utilize them that way. But there's other things, the Higg index and other parameters where there's a lot of public information out there and best practices that companies are sharing. Everybody, as Liz said, could do better, and we all need help and focus on that, but there are more resources. I'll try to think of more offline as well.
Great. Well, this is probably the last question. I'm going to summarize here. This is somebody who's in the industry and getting their MBA from sustainability at Bard. What do you think is pressuring companies the most, or which stakeholder, or what is forcing or encouraging businesses to change what they're doing? Where's that pressure coming from? What's the most effective, in your opinion?
From what I've seen, I'll start this one. The board of directors is very important. If they say something, the brand will listen to it. And so the more people that are on the board that are thinking this way, next time you're at a fancy cocktail party, make sure to make friends with someone who looks like they might be a board member and try to push the envelope here. But in addition to that, I think that it's important that every company just like really creates this culture. It has to be top down, but anybody can help.
Yeah, I think this is a funny question from an MBA student, because actually when I was getting my MBA, we were talking about Porter's 5 forces, and I said it was the consumer, and my professor corrected me and said it was the companies. So I think we're both, I think we're seeing it from all different angles these days. It'll be interesting to see. I think pressure from consumers is no joke, though. We vote every day with our wallets about where we can shop, and I urge everybody to just think a bit more wisely and thoughtfully about where they're shopping.
And legislation, obviously, would be that one too.
Yeah. Well, we've hit our time. Unfortunately, we have a bunch of questions that I'll send to you guys, and we will post in our executive summary. For everybody who's on this, and tell your colleagues that this will be posted on our website. The video will be. Liz and Ann, I can't thank you enough. That was fascinating. We could talk for another couple hours, I'm sure, and maybe we'll have a second installment of this discussion later on. But thank you both. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks so much. Nice to see you all today.
Thanks, everybody.
Get in touch if you have any additional questions, or if you need some help from CSR Talent Group. As Liz and Ann said, we can find the person you need to help you on your sustainability path. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time. Take care.